A super bright 120Hz display, a 200 megapixel camera, a 50 megapixel selfie camera, a premium eye-catching design, and a massive battery, all for less than 500 quid. This is the Honor 90, and it's the latest in their N range of smartphones, and it kind of sits somewhere between budget and mid-range device. So the Honor 90 comes in two flavors. There's an 8GB version with 256GB of memory. That is £449.99. There's also a 12GB version with 512GB of storage. That's £499.99. Inside, we've got the Snapdragon 7 Gen 1 chip and a 5000 mAh battery, which is capable of super fast 66-watt charging, which takes it from 0 to 20% in 5 minutes. The display is a 6.7-inch quad curved floating display with a 120Hz dynamic refresh rate, P3 color, HDR10+ support, and 1600 nits of peak brightness. The design is apparently inspired by high-end jewelry, so you get this kind of dual ring thing around the camera system, which includes a 200 megapixel main camera, a 12 megapixel ultra-wide which doubles as a macro lens, and a 2 megapixel depth lens. Selfies are taken care of with a 50 megapixel front-facing camera, and it's running a customized version of Android 13 known as Magic OS. That's quite an impressive spec for less than 500 quid, but what is it like to use? I think it's fair to say that smartphone design is as subjective as camera performance, which I'll get onto later, but I really like the look of the Honor 90. It comes in 3 colours. This is the emerald green, and it has this kind of, it's very hard to get across actually on the camera, but it's got this kind of speckled metallic finish. It feels premium as well, so there's not quite as much metal on display as, say, an iPhone, but you're not spending as much money as that. I'm getting a little bit fed up of phones where you can't use them one-handed. The iPhone 14 Pro Max, the S23 Ultra, you have to do this kind of finger gymnastics, which always results in you very nearly dropping the phone. That doesn't happen with this. And that brings me on to the display, which is absolutely stunning. So as mentioned earlier, it is a 6.7-inch display, and it has a dynamic refresh rate that goes all the way up to 120Hz, so it feels very smooth as well. It's also one of the brightest displays I've seen at this price point. 1600 nits of peak brightness is not to be sniffed at, and when you're outside you can really feel that. There's barely any bezels to talk of either. It's just this massive, expansive, bright, curved display, and it's not too curved either, so although it does curve at the edges, it's not as bad as some of the Samsung phones that do the same thing. There's some very clever stuff going on behind the scenes of this display as well. So Honor has this certification for their flicker-free technology, which uses clever dimming zones and stuff. Basically, it's a nod towards how much we use our smartphones these days, and it's designed to reduce eye strain. There's even a circadian display mode, which changes the color temperature of the display as the day wears on. So as you get nearer bedtime, it gets warmer, it gets slightly more orange compared to being blue, which in theory helps you prepare for sleep. And speaking of using your phone all the time, if you tend to watch a lot of Netflix and Amazon Prime stuff on the go, you'll be glad to know that this has full HDR certification. It does a brilliant job of enhancing standard definition content as well, so if you're watching a poorly streamed YouTube video, it's going to look great on the Honor 90. This display is an absolute triumph. As you might expect at this price point, Honor has had to make one or two concessions. The main one really is the chip they're using, which isn't the latest Snapdragon chip, but by today's standards, it still performs pretty well. This is the accelerated version. I don't know what that means, but I did run some benchmarks. I know, check me out. So in Geekbench, it scored a single core performance of 1098 and a dual core performance of 3189. design. And if we compare that against the Google Pixel 7a, which is one of the closest competitors of this phone, that is running Google's own Tensor G2 chip, and that scored a single core performance of 1,364 and a dual core performance of 3,294. Now, I don't know what any of those numbers mean, and yes, the 7a scores higher than the Honor 90, but in everyday use, you don't really notice much of a difference. And because of that 120Hz display, it still feels super smooth. A lot of this is down to Magic OS as well, which is a nice respectful tweak of Android 13. They haven't ruined it, they haven't changed it beyond all recognition. In terms of the battery performance, it is really good. That 5,000 mAh battery sails past one day, the standby time is fantastic, and that 66 watt super fast charging is genuinely very, very useful. But what you want to know is, what is the camera like? As always, just a very quick disclaimer about the photo performance of the Honor 90. This is the most subjective part of any smartphone review. What I like, you may not like, and vice versa. So the 200 megapixel main camera on the Honor 90 has a 25% bigger sensor than the previous generation, and that in theory gives us better low light performance. As for the images, I think the best way to describe the Honor 90 is a natural looking camera. We're used to oversaturated and highly processed images on today's smartphones, but the Honor 90 is refreshingly honest, really, in the photos that it takes. This does occasionally result in some less than spectacular photos, but on the whole, I like the way this captured the essence of my walk through Warwick. One thing I do like about the Honor 90 is how it doesn't completely overdo blue skies and green fields. It just captures them, again, naturally, without oversaturating the colours, and that big sensor definitely copes very well in low light situations. If you want to make the most of that 200 megapixel sensor, there is a high res mode, but it does capture massive files. They're about 24 meg versus the 2 or 3 meg of the regular photos, and that does have some benefits. It does mean you can zoom in quite a bit, but I think most people are going to shoot with the standard photos on this camera. We do get a bit of zoom to play with. There's a 2x, which is pretty good. Up to 3x isn't bad, but pushing beyond that really is pushing the limits of digital zoom. The 2 megapixel depth camera comes into effect when you use portrait mode, and I must say, I think the fake bokeh on the Honor 90 is very impressive. Even with complex subjects, the line between the foreground and the background looks impressively natural. As for the 12 megapixel ultra wide, I like the ultra wide shots on the Honor 90. There's very little distortion on the edges, and you can get some very nice results. This lens doubles as a macro, and while you can't get quite as close as an iPhone, you can get close enough to pick out detail and keep things relatively sharp. I think it produces fantastic selfies in both good and poor light, and the portrait mode looks very good for selfies as well. When it comes to video, you can shoot up to 4K in 30 frames per second. You can get 60 frames per second, but to get that you have to drop down to 1080p. This is one of those concessions based on the pricing of the Honor 90. Having said that, the good news is that the 4K footage this thing spits out is really, really impressive. It does feature that same muted and unsaturated colour profile that we saw in the photos earlier, but again, I'm a fan of this. There's also a bunch of modes to choose from HDR to portrait, close-up, etc. But if you turn on AI video, the software will take care of the choice of mode for you. And in my experience, that worked really well. But it's the stabilization that really impresses me with the Honor 90. So many Android phones have this kind of weird, jerky, shaky stabilization. You don't get that on the Honor 90. I also loved the multi-video option, which basically shoots from the rear and the selfie camera at the same time. This isn't unique, it's available on other phones, but it's nice to get it on the Honor 90, and it's a great way to do product demonstrations, or it's fantastic for social content. Okay, so this is the selfie camera on a deliberately noisy, busy road, just so you can hear the mic. I've not touched anything, I've not touched the video, not touched the audio. This is exactly what the Honor 90 does if you just hit record. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. The Honor 90 has really impressed me. I think given the fantastic display, the brilliant camera system, and the performance, which is better than the specs suggest, it's a bit of a no-brainer if you don't want to spend more than £500. What I love about the Honor 90 is that it proves you don't have to cut corners to get to this price point. You can still have a very good looking phone with a brilliant camera, an amazing display, and all the performance you need day to day, and great battery life without spending a fortune. So more of this please, and I'd love to know what you think about the Honor 90. Let me know in the comments. Are you going to go for this smartphone? And if you've still got some time and you want to see a smartphone right at the other end of the scale with some really bonkers specs, keep watching for a link to my full review of the Sony One Mark V.